Morning. Nice to see you all.
Good morning.
Sent around an email and Sorcha's gonna send around Zoom information later, but just a reminder that we are meeting today from 1 to 5. I know that some people are not gonna be able to be there for the whole block, but I think enough people will be able to be there for each block that it will work. And we won't be making any final decisions that day, I promise. It's mostly gonna be an opportunity for us to get our heads around what this education committee voted out. So that we can all go into the week fully prepared with that. As I know for me, unless the time is very explicitly put aside, I might necessarily get through all of my reading, and I think it's gonna be a very complicated bill, so having Beth talk us through it will be very. So in the spirit of getting prepared for next week, I'd love to just spend this time before the floor hearing from folks on what you need. We've had unbelievably scattered testimony this week. I'm really sorry about that. There's nothing I could have done about it, but it's still a bummer. And so would just love an open conversation. We have staff here who can clarify small pieces that might help us get to better clarity, but just to be thinking about what we want to be getting clearer on next week. Some pieces that I can offer or that we will know what bill we're plugging all of this policy into. And so that will be so nice and contextful. So we'll be able to move from 5 pieces to 1 piece. I've heard requests from folks that like when we actually blend the bill together, we sort of straw poll sections and then vote the full bill. That sounds like a great plan. Planning to hear from all of the stakeholders that we heard from on Wednesday? Is that Wednesday? Great. On Wednesday, at least one more time. And they've all been requested to send in sort of testimony as we're going for us to read. And we'll make sure to circulate that as we go and maybe even combine it all for us to be looking at. If there's anyone who did not come in that sort of slew, let's start there. If there's anyone that did not come in that lovely stack of stakeholders who you would like to hear from, please let me know. You're welcome to say it now. You're welcome to send an email, whatever works for you. Are you one of those people? Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay.
I was waiting.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
wanted to mention, we got an informative letter from Vala.
Yes.
this morning.
Mhm. And I think there was a second one that came first one that came a couple days ago too.
Yeah. Would be good
Yep.
if folks could read that. I
Yep.
don't think we need to hear from those folks personally, but
From Vala.
Yeah, they sent a great, very detailed feedback. Yeah,
I realize I want to thank JFO for the amazing work they've been doing. And I realize that there's some things we can't answer, but I just want to say I'm a little concerned about what's happening above the exemptions. You're only eligible for the exemption if you're at 115 or below. That's
the homestead
Oh,
exemption.
the homestead
Yeah,
exemption,
okay,
sorry, I'm a
cool.
little, just still waking
Yeah,
up here,
okay.
still kicking in.
Yeah.
But I'm worried about the impact on people who are now between that and
Yep.
what was hit last.
Totally.
Because we're effectively raising tax on everyone else to fund. But given what we've seen in terms of the growth of property values, et cetera, and the stagnation of wages, we're gonna hit a different group very, very hard.
We can talk more about those dynamics, absolutely. And see if tax can offer some thoughts on that as well. Other testimony that needs to be in the mix. I know we're just getting our head around it. Is it helpful for me to talk about the buckets as a way of guiding this conversation? Bucket by bucket? Okay. First bucket, appraisal. We're hearing from tax this afternoon. We've had to reschedule them 3 times because of the floor. They were supposed to come in on, I think, Wednesday, and then Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So if tax is watching, I'm so sorry about your own schedules, and they'll be coming in this afternoon and then again next week. So that's one thing on reappraisals. We have the Vala testimony with some detail on it. What else? Yeah.
What about Ed Kleinfelder? I mean, he's been in before, I guess, last year.
And Kleinfelder?
Ed Clodfelter from
Okay.
Nimrick.
Oh, Nimerick, thank you,
Nimerick.
yep, cool, thanks.
And even though Jake is coming, PVR would be great to hear from.
Yes, I think they're, yes, 100%. When I say for tax, we would need Rebecca, Jill, and Jake, like for various things.
And regarding the piece that we're talking about in terms of classifications of property, I would like to have just a general discussion of why we're even considering that and what are the advantages and disadvantages of having those classifications.
Yeah.
And our 67-page initial, the classifications pieces in there, but I don't see where the regional assessing districts piece is in there.
That is still hanging out in a separate bill so that John and Kirby can just be working simultaneously, because if it was in one bill, they wouldn't both be able to work at once. So
Yep.
that's still its own, yeah. Anything else on appraisals that folks think we need to hear? I think there's things we need to work through with the tax department, very much so, like a lot of logistical stuff, but
Mine was an appraisal.
okay, great. Classifications, request from Representative Feltus to just have an open conversation about it. Maybe we could even do that today. I don't know, but I'm just gonna noted. I imagine that a lot of the stakeholders that are sort of on that list want to weigh in on classifications. And Austin from the Lake Champlain Chamber told me he has an expanded group of stakeholders that are going to want to weigh in on that. I don't know who those people are yet, though. And anything else on that? Yeah.
Or I'm gonna wait till you stop saying on that. Sorry, it's not on appraisals. It's not on that piece. of
Is it on classifications? Great. Okay. Anything else in classifications?
Just maybe some, I don't know if the Lake Champlain Chamber represents who might be included in the resort category, but maybe somebody from the resort category.
Great. And then I imagine that we still actually just need more clarity on the language in the bill. Does that sound right? Kirby has a flow chart that we can look at maybe today, like maybe this morning, maybe after. And then maybe this afternoon, flow charts, I think would really help with this. And then I think we still need to get very clear on what to do about mixed use. Yes, okay.
Mhm.
Somebody had an idea of how to help us better define it. Can't remember who that was.
Are you saying what you just said?
Say again, there was somebody that we heard from that said they had a possibility of helping. I think it was.
That was the chamber,
Spirit.
that was the, yeah, it was Amy Spear from the chamber.
State chamber,
Yes.
yeah.
Proportional.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I can, if that, I will reshare that testimony from her about that.
Is there someone that we should talk to about farms and farm buildings? Just because it struck me as strange that was lumped in with resorts, and I don't know, that seems like a stakeholder that we haven't.
I don't think it was lumped in with resorts.
I thought it was lumped in with,
Commercial.
it's lumped in with commercial,
Commercial, yeah,
sorry,
yeah,
which had timeshares.
Yeah.
It was not resorts, it was timeshares.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And so I just didn't,
Yep.
I can't think of a stakeholder we've had that focuses.
So VHCB is, it's housing and conservation. The conservation side is very helpful in thinking about land use, and they're, in terms of sort of like stakeholders that work with current use in the public world, they're generally great for that, so I can invite them in. I don't think we've ever had testimony from Trey.
I was thinking if we're going to do classifications and we really probably want all property types, if you imagine a map of Vermont to be classified, then if we need testimony or what we need to, something we didn't put on there is nonprofit land.
So I think that does have a category. We might have just missed it in our overview of the bill.
Oh,
But that'll
Public use.
become clear when we look at the flow chart, because flow charts make things clear,
okay.
at least for my head, yeah.
And maybe, you already know, Bridget, but the farm buildings, if you are in current use, are exempt from taxation. There's a zero figure for
Yeah, okay.
current use anyway.
I believe there are some farms that are classified as mixed use too, though, and do provide housing.
And we will hear from VHCD to get clearer on that. And I did, I think maybe even before January, I had a conversation, a preliminary conversation with Trey about it. So I think he is monitoring this conversation.
Mhm.
Anything else on classifications? Great. Okay, we are, update on timing for our morning. We're gonna go to the floor, probably be late for the devotional. Be there for third reading of budget and yield bill, and then we're gonna leave the floor. And, I said it was possible, but the speaker's given us permission to be off the floor. So we will miss the capital bill, and then we'll be here. Okay. Just wanted to say that publicly. Okay, next bucket is, spending over the foundation formula payment.
Whatever we call it.
Yeah, it needs a new name.
It needs a new name. Okay, so, on the new name, I really don't want to spend 2 hours in committee, everyone wordsmithing the branding of this proposal together. So if folks could like really come with real proposals on that, that would be great, and like navigate it amongst yourselves before we all get here. Because I think it's really, really important. I just can imagine how nightmarish that conversation will happen if we're all just having it at the table. So do your thinking on it, please. Okay, anything else on that? I think what the 10% means, we need some like sort of numeric analysis on that. I think it would be helpful to hear from AOE about that.
Would also encourage us to get someone in from another state district.
Mhm.
It would be helpful to talk to somebody who's actually got this type of program up and running right now. The difficulty, I don't know if it's state, some of the tax department or a different state.
What kind of what?
Somebody who has the over and above spending above the base. Somebody's already administering that program in another state to just talk about what kind of pitfalls to avoid.
Oh, interesting.
And in that vein, I wonder if it makes sense to have somebody just lay out, there are different ways to do spending above the base. We chose one. And even just seeing the 3 or 4 ways that people handle it helps us evaluate the trade-offs, because there is no perfect way to do this. There are trade-offs in every way you do it.
Thank you. For me, a big standout there is the residue of bonding in new districts. So I'd love to have the bond bank in. I think that's like a big lingering detail.
I don't know if this goes to, above and beyond the base spending, but, some of the superintendents yesterday mentioned, how we're gonna deal with, healthcare costs and like, I don't know if that's in that bucket or not, or how it's gonna do.
It could be if we don't handle it well in the foundation formula.
Right.
Yeah, so foundation formula inflators. I think Julia's doing some research on that.
On the bonding, that's another issue where there are different ways you could handle it. And if we could just present those different ways with the pros and cons of each, because there are some significant equity issues around bonding right now.
Yes.
That are not being talked about.
And to that
We're
point,
going through the buckets of work and talking about what we're gonna need.
I'm just wondering if through Act 46, where that already occurred, school districts then combining,
Yep,
what did they do with their existing debt? So we have some history here.
yep,
Who has the best insight as to how it worked?
we will figure that out.
So that was very different.
Different, but are there similarities?
There is established practice, but it was very different.
And we will talk about that next week. Okay. Other above the base things we would need to be figuring out. We need to hear from the tax department about it, of course.
I don't know how it's gonna interact, but it's clear there's significant, and I'll work on some suggestions for Monday, but significant issues around special education that may also play into that conversation about above the base. I just don't know. I need to think that through.
I think we heard that there was a list. The Vermont Superintendent's Association spoke about a list of underfunded and unfunded mandates at the state level.
Yes, she was gonna send that.
if she
Yeah,
could.
okay, yep.
And I think that we should look at that at the federal level also, because that's significant.
I mean, or there will be none.
But
Now there are a lot. There'll be some, not where we've been.
and that would be,
Sorry, I have to joke about it because it's all I have. Can you
that
follow up
would be
and-
above the base.
I'm struggling with how to frame the question, but, I still, even after talking to Tammy, and she assuaged my fears a little bit, but about collective bargaining agreements and how districts that are paying teachers a lot more are gonna interact in this, because that's my fear, is that a lot of this, whatever we're gonna call it, excess spending, or, you know, whatever the phrase ends up being. I worry that for at least the early part of the implementation of foundation formula, that may be by districts that have higher
Mhm. Yep.
salary costs that are part of collective bargaining agreements. And I don't know if the Vermont EA is the right folks to come in and talk about that, or who the right witnesses might be, but it feels like a discussion that we should probably have.
So I think the bill will come to us with a lot of language around what will happen to collective bargaining agreements. Or a plan for setting that in place. I think what we can hear from Professor Colby about, and maybe some other folks, is how foundation formulas should adapt or not adapt for changing salary things, and what incentives or perverse incentives we put in place when we do things like that. Because in background conversations with her, it sounds a little counterintuitive. Or someone's that.
Sorry if someone already said this. Apologies for being late. Transportation
Mhm.
costs.
Yep, I'm gonna put that in the foundation formula rather than the 10%.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Let's go back to the 10%.
So,
Yes.
regarding Tammy, on her way out the door, she promised to send me a study she had done a couple of years ago on one salary schedule for the whole state.
Okay,
Different states had done it, what
Yeah.
worked, what didn't work. When I get that, I'll share it with everybody.
Okay.
But she hasn't sent it yet.
great. Representative Bodie.
I'm not sure where to say to put this, but when you have the weighted students and you've combined them to
Let's hold on
your
to
district.
that for a minute and just try to finish the above the threshold.
Well, that goes along with the collective agreement, collective bargaining.
Okay, which I think also
Probably,
not about
I
above the
probably
threshold. Okay,
All right.
okay, above, just anything else on above the threshold.
All right.
Okay,
Just
Imagine
one
we-
thing,
we
is
need
there a
more-
limit on what that spending, I mean, we've talked about a percentage.
Yeah.
Is there a use designation for the above the use spending?
thank you.
I don't understand that question.
Well, if they decide to spend it on something that's offering far more field trips, or I guess just some non-educational, I don't know what that might be, I guess. Just making sure that it fits in with the whole.
That's something that we spent a lot of time on last biennium, talking about how, and generally came to the conclusion that, like, no matter how you try to do that in intent, you wind up just creating incentives for people to like do bad accounting practices. But we can talk about it more, because it comes up. Anything else on above the base? I think we need to like see more financial analysis of it. Of course, yeah,
Key.
okay, great. Foundation formula.
If I just speak a little bit more to
Yes,
transportation costs.
Yep.
We heard the proposal from the administration to go from 50 to 100%, you know, and I know that's probably a lot tied to what the district lines end up being, and I know we're not there yet. But there was also an offhand comment made by, I think, JFO earlier in testimony about when the 100% ends. And I don't think we ever got it clear.
So I think there's a real question about if you create 100% reimbursable categorical grant, what rules do attach to it, right? And that's probably, the rules for it are probably outside of this committee, but we need to make sure we're getting clear that
Yes.
there are very different incentives in 100% categorical grant.
In the context of the whole scheme, I wonder if it makes sense to have Ledge Council just sort of brief us on what states do versus what school boards do, because there is serious risk in trying to micromanage the heck out of schools at this level.
Yes.
Because what we do is drive up costs without improving product.
What else do we need to hear on the foundation formula? Yes.
I guess it kind of depends on what the goal is by the end of next week, right? So are we expected to have a number that we are putting out with base and weights it has a number behind it by the end of next week?
I think probably, so I'm hoping to get, Professor Colby did back of the envelope numbers for us and is refining those numbers right now. And hoping to get those from her before we vote the bill out.
So one thing that I feel like we probably need, and maybe there's someone either from Commerce or one of their witnesses they've already seen, or some summary of CTE and how that would fit into the base or categorical
Yep,
funding.
so real. Thank you.
And bonds, I think you've already mentioned that, and then nutrition I had on my list, and special ed, which you've already mentioned. Just some topics that aren't necessarily, and maybe Tammy has them in her numbers, but
Yeah, so there's some stuff that Professor Colby will likely include, and I think we need to have a conversation about pre-K. Representative Feltus.
I think we need to make sure that we figure out how we're gonna handle tuition to students.
Yeah, that's what I was just trying to.
Thank you.
And to support that conversation, I think we need a conversation of what public schools are required to do, but private schools are not required to do, because the foundation is designed to fund public education. It is not equivalent to what we require.
And that is what Beth's walkthrough will help us with, because we're not gonna change what one is required to do or the other is required to do. It's the education committee. We want to make sure that the dollars that are going match up with that. Yes.
The administration's proposal had guidance counselors, mental health counselors, and social workers all looped into one amount, and I still feel strongly that those are three different. I'd be curious Tammy's thoughts on how to build that formula.
So the way Professor Colby does modeling, it's based on using current costs efficiently. It's not built in sort of a stacked system about how much we estimate each
Okay.
thing will cost. And so it's, and we can have her explain all of that.
Okay.
Yes.
And one thing we've heard a lot, the word outcome, but it hasn't really been defined. Are we looking at the outcome we have now?
Mhm.
Or are we looking at the outcome we want in the future? And I know that's not our bailiwick, but if the ed committee has defined it, let's make sure they come in here and explain where we're headed.
Yep.
Okay. And that goes along with the private school and public school thing too.
Anything else on the foundation formula? I imagine the weights.
Yes,
Are we keeping our current weights? How are the weights going to change?
Yeah.
All of those things. Are the weights encompassing everything? Are the weights sensitive to changes? Are the weights sensitive to changes on the federal level? All those things.
it's a variable weight.
Yep.
They're variable base, sorry.
Representative Bodie.
This may be a governance question. But if they're larger government, even today, with what we have with weights, how do we protect those weights and what they can provide in dollars for the populations that they're trying to help? How do we protect those resources from being used to
do something
take
else other
advantage
than what
of-
they're doing.
To kind of, to do something else, like to help with the collective bargaining agreements being different.
So one of the considerations of a foundation formula that Professor Colby took us through, not this time, I missed some of her testimony, but in previous time she testified, is how the weights especially, but the funding is distributed within a school system. The real difference between weights and categorical grants is that weights are not directive, and I think there's a lot of good reasons for that pedagogically, but the how they're distributed within a school system is a really important part if we're looking at bigger districts. And that's something she talked about in the second time she testified, but we can get some more on that. Yeah.
Also, again, apologies, if what we're going to use to determine enrollment numbers, whether we're sticking with long-term weighted, whether not to have a policy, the 2-year average makes sense to me, so I just want to have a conversation.
Thank you. And I really don't remember if the administration's proposal spoke to that or not, so we can. Representative Massa.
Yeah, I'm not sure what fits in this conversation, but one of the things that I asked Professor Colby about yesterday, and it's been continuously a concern to me, is that the change in responsibility, I guess is the right word, from back up, with regards to special ed and student mental health. One of the things that's always been getting more and more a concern to me is how do we differentiate between who does what with regards to which things? And Professor Colby gave an explanation that made pretty good sense, but I'm going to have to go through her slides a couple more times before I think I'm confident and I can explain it to other people.
Mhm.
So it it's sort of in the broad amorphous cloud of are we fully understanding what we're doing as we're changing from one thing to another?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure. I, for my part, I can draw a diagram and it might make sense to people, but then I couldn't explain it.
Mhm.
If that helps.
Yeah, and I really encourage
Yeah.
people over the weekend, I'm sorry, to spend real time on our previous testimony to get your heads around that.
Thank you.
We were sort of like very focused on witnesses earlier in this bucketing, and then everyone's like not talking about witnesses now. And so I have a question about, so we heard from sort of all the witnesses in a great big stack speaking to the whole bill. Is it easier if we have witnesses speak to each bucket separately and I organize that testimony separately?
Yes.
Okay,
Lost.
great.
Especially.
With respect to the foundation plan, we'd asked a couple weeks ago for data on biggest cost drivers in the ed fund, both in percentage and mid dollars. And we haven't gotten that information yet. It would be really helpful to get that to evaluate where we are with respect to any proposed foundation. And two other things I think we have to have a conversation around. One is adult education. And Julia confirmed that the language in the draft is sort of residual pre-Act 60 language. And the way we're doing things is not, it's different. And they're driving ADM. So we have to talk about adult ed separately.
And I'm hoping that you and Representative Feltus are gonna bring us out.
But there's another piece, and one more piece is related to this. There's another piece. We also, in this body, chose to extend dual enrollment to every single adult without a diploma, which is potentially significant driver of growth in the ed fund. And we have to talk about that. And in Title 2A WIOA work, adult CT is under DOL. It's not under education. We have moved adult education from that world into the ed fund. And we ought to be talking about what is the right place to fund that. And we can talk about that. But if this dual enrollment is now being attached to that, we've now made it more inextricable. And separately, we need to talk about categorical grants.
Yes.
And what is happening with early college and dual enrollment, because the foundation plan won't drive revenue for those programs anymore.
Absolutely. Anyone else on foundation formula and or weights? Yes,
I hate to even bring this up, but you know.
that's what we're doing right now.
If we're talking about adult education, then aren't we talking about also baby education, tiny little?
We're not talking about tiny little people. We are talking about pre-K students, which are 3 and 4 year olds, and the tiny people get to live in the Human Services Committee and in the CCFAP fund and are not part of the education fund.
Then why don't the adults get to live in their world?
That is, I think, what Representative Polk was asking.
Not fair.
And there, yeah, but previous decisions were made and we have to check in on those. Yeah.
Just the timeline piece, and I think some of it's in there already, but to make sure that it's understandable enough so that I can express it to folks as far as transitioning timelines. What's it gonna, how's it gonna happen and where's it gonna?
So much so, yes.
Yeah, along that line, I'm wondering.
Need a map.
If we know what we have to build as a bridge from where we are to where we go with the foundation formula, and is there something else that we have to come up with for a funding formula for the existing state of education?
Oh, a transition plan.
Yeah,
Yeah, good one. Good.
Underline that one.
just the money, you know.
And to throw into that, how are we going to try to bring down costs before fiscal year 27, since we've just blown $120 million hole in that fund, sorry.
And I,
Yep.
believe that we're gonna have proposals from the education committee that address some of that, and we will attend to it. And I think the conversation about pre-K and CTE, sorry, not CTE, pre-K and dual enrollment and those might, and adult ed might help with that, but I'm not sure. Anything else?
Short list.
Thanks, Charlie.
That's easy.
Okay, so I think before we go to the floor, Kirby, can you just show us your flow chart? So we can have that flow chart in our lovely little heads. Thanks.
Hop on Zoom real quick.
Do it slowly if you want.
I want to keep you from the Capitol bell.
I'm gonna get a text from the professional number. And folks, just in terms of like sort of how I'm thinking about timing and the combining of language. I was imagining that we would straw poll sections on Thursday and then vote on the full bill on Friday. Just so folks are thinking about that progression. And so that staff is thinking about that progression as well. And it's also very possible that the education committee is going to be voting out our bill. That's not possible. That's happening. The education committee is going to vote out their bill. They might have technical amendments as things sit and they get, that always happens, right? That we might adopt. If we start wading into their policy, I mean, this is always true that we try not to wade into policy. If we wade into their policy, we are never gonna get done with our work. So it's gonna be hard, but important that we understand it. So we're aligning with it, but that we're not changing it, that's on them to change it. Yeah.
Can we adopt their technical amendments as our amendments in our draft?
Maybe we'll figure that
I
out.
think it a lot easier to read.
It'll make it a lot easier to read. We might also have a strike all amendment that includes our technical amendments. And I'll talk to the attorneys and Betsy Ann about that. That whatever is on the calendar on the floor needs to be readable. Yay.
Good morning, everyone. Kirby Keaton Legislative Council. I created this flow chart. I didn't get any help from people who are way better at making flow charts than me. When I worked at tax, shout out to, there's an employee there named Angela, who's really great at making everything look good. Angela did not help me.
You did this on your own.
I'm a big boy. So here we go. We have a flow chart for classifications as it's currently structured in draft 1.1 of the consolidated ed finance and classifications bill that John put together. So we'll just walk through the questions you would ask the way it's currently drafted. And I will note, I mean, there are things I'm aware of that need to be cleaned up, but we're going to go through how it's meant to go as it's drafted. So your first question would be, is it exempt from state property tax? These first three things, you wouldn't even necessarily ask them because they would kind of just already be happening on the grant list. But for the purposes of the flow chart, we're going to imagine you'll go through it step by step. So is it exempt? If it is exempt from state property tax, that is not just muni only, but state, then it's going to be called public use, right? And then that's going to be on the grant list already because the exemption will already be there. Easy enough. You also just have that marked in the tax classification column that would exist in the grant list and move on. The second question would be, is this owned by an operator of a ski facility and used for the ski facility? This is the resort classification and how it's currently defined. Under the language we have now, PBR would be doing the homework in identifying what parcels this would apply. And PBR would be instructing listers and assessors what to do on the grant list for this class classification. So That's the next question. And if it is, then it gets marked as that and it doesn't, the way it's written now, because it's written in a way to sort of work around the mixed use question right now. Doesn't matter what other uses, it's put down as ski. Or as resort, I'm sorry. Next question you would ask, does it meet the definition of affordable housing? We have that definition. The definition we have currently relates to types of affordable housing that would not be exempt, right? Because some of it will go into public use. But the definition we have is for housing subsidy covenants and similar situations like that, where it's owner occupied, but it's still subsidized kind of situation, stuff like that, right? That's the definition we have now. So if it is affordable housing, it would be marked as that as a tax classification. And then you would move on to the next question, which is really gets into the flow chart territory where there is a hierarchy of where things default, right? Next question is there any dwelling unit habitable on a year-round basis with no homestead declaration or landlord certificate? This, if the answer is yes here, then it gets put into either residential A or residential B, depending on what its equalized value is, right? So you could have short-term rentals or long-term rentals on also being used on that property. But if there's any unit there that falls into this residential A or B, which is in a way a proxy for second homes, then it gets put there. The policy reasons behind this is kind of like one thing you have to think about. If we do a system where things default one way or another, you've heard testimony, I know, about distortion, about how these things could affect how a property owner uses their property. That is true about this, but a distortion in the tax code that's not intentional is generally not good. But if you are intending to have distortion, if you are intending to use this as a policy tool, that's a different question. So as this ranks up now, there's an incentive, a distortion to encourage units not to be left open. Because it would, if you have a higher second home rate, and when there's units that are left open, if they default to that, then there's an incentive not to have that. Making sure that we work this out in a way and structure it in a way, which I think you'll hear from Jake later. If I know Jake, he's going to probably talk about working out in the weed stuff about it, but that's the idea, right? Next question after the residential part. Are there one or more dwelling units with an affiliated landlord certificate? This means it's already passed the test for the residential. It means that there must not be any dwelling units that are left open, so to speak, where people aren't living, right? So are there any dwelling units then with a landlord certificate? If yes, it gets put in the apartment category. And again, if you want to use this as a policy tool where apartment would be a desirable place to be, if you want this to drive housing or the creation of housing, then it's just kind of assumed that this will be a lower rate, one that you will encourage landowners to try to be in. Have some apartments in your parcel so that you can, if you want to try to get this low rate. Couple things to flag real quick here to think about when it comes to landlord certificate. There's not extra language at this point that going beyond just landlord certificate. Right now in Vermont, a landlord certificate must be filed if there's a long-term renter for 30 days or more. So thinking about if you want that to be longer and whether the Department of Taxes can, on the landlord certificate right now, there's a column for how many months there's a renter there. If you wanted to say make it 6 months instead of just the minimal 30 days, because the distortion that you've heard about will exist. And do you want to set up a situation where a person can have a renter for just 30 days a year, file their landlord certificate and get that classification? Am I taking too long? Okay. Just stop here.
Will you just scroll up so we see, is there a lot more scrolling?
There's 3 more questions.
Okay.
After apartment,
Nope.
after apartment, you asked, is it industrial? So it means that it didn't pass the first two, it wasn't residential, it wasn't apartment, is it industrial? If yes, then it will be considered industrial under this language. Next question, is it commercial? If it's not any of the things above and it's commercial, you mark it as commercial, and then at the end, then it must be undeveloped land, or else we have a huge mistake, because we've got nowhere else to go from here. So that's the flow chart of the kind of questions you would ask to figure out how to classify it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're gonna stop now and we'll be back here after the